As of today, every credited cast member of Ben-Hur, the 1959 version, the one that won 11 Oscars and made Charlton Heston a god in a toga, is dead. The last one standing was Chariot, the Israeli actress who played Esther. She made it all the way to 2021, dying quietly at her home in Buckinghamshire at 89. 62 years between the wrap of that film and the closing of that final chapter. But there's a rumor that's outlived almost all of them anyway. For decades, people have whispered that during the filming of the legendary Chariot race, a stuntman was killed on camera, and that the studio left his death in the final cut because the footage was simply too good to throw away. It's one of the most durable urban legends in Hollywood history. It's false, but the true story is, in its own way, even better, because it's not about a studio covering up a death. It's about a father watching his son get hurled into the air at full gallop, certain for one frozen second that he was about to watch him die on camera. Let's start there. The rumor has a few different versions. In one, it's a stand-in for Stephen Boyd's villain, Masala, dragged to death behind the horses. In another, it's a nameless extra. Andrew Martin, who co-directed the race, once got so fed up with reporters at a press conference that he snapped that 20 men and 100 horses had died making the sequence, sarcastically, just to give them the lurid quote they were fishing for. It backfired. People believed him. Here's what actually happened. The Chariot race took 5 weeks to film, cost roughly $1 million to build the set for, and burned through 263 feet of film for every 1 foot that made the final cut, one of the highest shooting ratios in movie history. Stunt coordinator Yakima Canute, the man who'd basically invented the modern stunt profession, ran the whole thing like a military operation. Hydraulic brakes hidden in the chariots, padded harnesses, months of rehearsal. Not one horse was seriously hurt. Not one stuntman died. The closest call belonged to Canute's own son. Joe Canute was doubling for Heston in the shot where Ben-Hur's chariot vaults over the wreckage of another team. Yakima had told him explicitly, don't grab the front rail. Joe either forgot or panicked, grabbed it anyway, and the impact launched him clean out of the chariot, over the yoke, almost under the hooves of his own team. For one moment, his father was certain he'd just watched his son die in front of 42 cameras. Joe caught himself on the central hitching rail, scrambled back into the chariot, and kept driving. His only injury was a gash on the chin that took 4 stitches to close. The footage was so visceral that the filmmakers couldn't bring themselves to cut it, so the genuine accident and Heston's staged climb back into the chariot were spliced together into the single most famous shot in the entire race. Heston wrote later that nobody was seriously hurt making the picture. The one real fatality connected to the production was producer Sam Zimbalist, who suffered a heart attack on set and died that same night. Nothing to do with the chariots at all. So the legend got the emotion right and the facts wrong. Something did almost happen. It just wasn't a death, and it wasn't a cover-up. It was a father's worst 11 seconds, immortalized by accident, in a movie that's been lying to audiences about its own danger for over 60 years. in the most flattering way possible. Nobody in Ben-Hur plays Yakima Canute, because Yakima Canute wasn't an actor in this picture. He was the architect. But the chariot race is, in a real sense, his performance. Born Enos Edward Canute on a ranch in the Snake River Hills of Washington State, he was a multiple-time world champion rodeo rider before he ever got near a film set. Hollywood didn't make him fearless. The rodeo circuit already had. Canute basically built the modern stunt profession out of nothing. He invented the technique of leaping from a moving stagecoach onto a galloping team of horses, the stunt Steven Spielberg would later pay homage to in Raiders of the Lost Ark. He taught John Wayne how to fall off a horse and how to throw a screen punch that looked real without anyone getting hit. By the time MGM brought him in for Ben-Hur, he'd already lived through an industry that, in its silent era infancy, had killed 55 people on movie sets in just 5 years. He spent the rest of his career trying to make sure that number never grew again, designing hydraulic chariot brakes and animal harnesses, specifically so the Ben-Hur race could look as lethal as the one in the 1925 version, without anyone actually dying making it. Yakima Canute died of cardiac arrest in 1986 at 90 years old, the most respected stuntman in the history of the medium. His son Joe, the boy who'd been thrown from that chariot, followed his father into the stunt business and spent the next 5 decades doubling for Charlton Heston again and again on Soylent Green, Earthquake, The Omega Man. In a strange final act twist, he also became an accomplished commercial fisherman, splitting his later years between Hollywood action sequences and actual ocean work. Joe Canute died in 2018 at 81, in the same Santa Ynez Valley he'd called home for decades. The man people thought was killed on camera lived to be 81, became a fisherman, and spent his whole career doubling for the same movie star who once watched him nearly die. Which detail of the chariot race surprised you most? The 4 stitches? Or the fact that the death was a producer's heart attack? Tell me in the comments. On screen, Heston was carved out of the same marble as his characters, Moses, El Cid, Michelangelo, and now a Jewish prince turned galley slave turned chariot champion. Off-screen, the resemblance wasn't an act. He really had served in World War II as a radio operator and aerial gunner with the Army Air Corps in the Aleutians. He really had marched for civil rights in the early 1960s, years before it was safe or fashionable for a leading man to do so. Heston had never driven a chariot before signing on to this film. He trained for months under Yakima Canute, learning to handle a 4-horse team well enough that he eventually needed no double at all for most of the race, only for the genuinely dangerous moments where Joe Canute took over. He later credited Canute with single-handedly turning stunt work from a reckless sideshow into a respected craft. Ben-Hur won him the Academy Award for Best Actor, and he spent the next 4 decades alternating between prestige epics and increasingly political public life, eventually serving 5 terms as president of the National Rifle Association, a term that recast his public image almost as dramatically as any role he ever played. In 2002, Heston announced he had symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease, recording a videotaped message in which he said that for an actor, there's no greater loss than losing his audience. He died at home in Beverly Hills in April 2008 at 84, with his wife of 64 years at his side. His death certificate would later list pneumonia as the immediate cause.
The actor who played history's most famous chariot racer had never held a set of reins until a Washington State rodeo cowboy taught him how. Masala is one of cinema's great tragic villains, magnetic, ruthless, and visibly in love with his own betrayal of his oldest friend. Stephen Boyd, born William Millar in Northern Ireland, was the youngest of 9 children who left school at 14 to work as a messenger boy before talent and nerve carried him onto the stage and then into film.
Boyd did almost all of his own stunts for the role, wearing steel-lined armor under his costume for the scene where Masala is dragged and trampled. Only a couple of moments were handed to a double or a dummy. Screenwriter Gore Vidal later revealed that he'd quietly instructed Boyd to play the early reunion scene with an undercurrent of old romantic intimacy between Masala and Judah, and that director William Wyler told Vidal directly not to mention it to Heston, for fear Heston would refuse to play the scene at all. Boyd was briefly the favorite to play Mark Antony opposite Elizabeth Taylor in Cleopatra, but production delays forced him to drop out. He was replaced by Richard Burton, whose romance with Taylor became one of the most famous love stories in Hollywood history. Boyd joked for years that fate had cost him a wedding invitation. He spent the 1970s working steadily but quietly, taking roles across South Africa, Jamaica, and Australia, before a guest appearance on Hawaii Five-0 that would air after his death. On June 2nd, 1977, he collapsed of a massive heart attack while playing golf with his wife at a country club north of Los Angeles. He was 45. He was cremated and interred at Oakwood Memorial Park in Chatsworth, California.
The man who lost Cleopatra's leading man to a scheduling conflict spent his whole career being remembered for losing, on screen, to the man he'd grown up loving like a brother. Hawkins built a career out of playing exactly the kind of stoic, commanding authority figure he portrays as Arius, the Roman officer who adopts Judah as his son. The real Hawkins, by his own admission, was politically liberal and emotionally expressive, almost the opposite of the buttoned-up Englishman he was famous for playing. By the time he made Ben-Hur, Hawkins was already secretly fighting throat cancer, though it wouldn't be diagnosed for several more years. A lifelong 3-pack-a-day smoker, he had his entire larynx removed in 1968 after the cancer was finally confirmed. He kept acting anyway, having his dialogue dubbed afterward by other actors, sometimes with his blessing, in films where audiences had no idea the voice they were hearing wasn't his own. He continued working for years with no voice of his own, appearing in films like Waterloo and Young Winston, purely on the strength of his physical presence. He underwent a second operation in 1968 to try to restore his speech. It left him with only a rough croak. In 1973, he underwent surgery to fit an artificial voice box. The operation went wrong. He developed a secondary hemorrhage and died at a London hospital that July, at 62. He left behind almost nothing financially. Heavy British taxes and years of reduced income from his illness had eaten through his estate. He was cremated at Golders Green. The actor most famous for playing men whose authority came from never raising their voice spent his final 7 years literally unable to use his own. If you had to pick one of these stories to tell a friend who's never seen Ben-Hur, which one would you lead with? Drop it below.
Ilderim is warmth and showmanship personified, the desert sheik who bets everything on Judah and his white horses. Hugh Griffith,
a former bank teller from a small village on the island of Anglesey in North Wales, brought a similar larger-than-life energy to nearly every role he ever played, on stage or screen. Griffith trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art after winning a scholarship, graduating top of a class of 300, then promptly lost years of momentum serving in World War II in India and Burma. By the time he won the Academy Award for playing Ilderim, he'd already built a reputation in the theater world for both his talent and his appetite for chaos. He was, by multiple accounts, drunk for stretches of the filming of Tom Jones a few years later, and was known for running naked through hotel hallways during shoots.
A prank he was reportedly fond of repeating. He was nominated for a second Oscar for Tom Jones and kept working steadily through the 1960s and 70s in films like Oliver and Mutiny on the Bounty, even as alcoholism increasingly shadowed his off-screen life. Griffith died of a heart attack at his London home in May 1980 at 67 after years of declining health linked to long-term drinking. He was cremated at Golders Green, the same crematorium where Jack Hawkins had been laid to rest 7 years earlier. The actor who won an Oscar for playing a man wealthy enough to bet his fortune on a chariot race spent his own later years losing far more to a bottle than he ever did to bad luck. Esther is gentle, loyal, almost saintly, Judah's anchor back to humanity. Haya Hararit, born Haya Newberg in what was then British Mandatory Palestine, was nothing like that in real life. Ambitious, multilingual, and quietly furious at being boxed into exotic beauty roles for the rest of her career. She was chosen for the role over more than 30 other actresses, including Ava Gardner, on the strength of a 30-second silent screen test. Once she'd had enough of being typecast in biblical pictures, she invented a clever exit strategy. She told MGM that her socialist friendships might embarrass the studio if anyone assumed she was a communist sympathizer, which she wasn't, purely to talk her way out of her contract early. She walked almost entirely away from acting by the mid-1970s, earned a political science degree from the London School of Economics, and reinvented herself as a screenwriter, co-writing the unsettling family drama Our Mother's House. She married its director, Jack Clayton, beginning a relationship that lasted until his death in 1995. Harari died at her home in Marlow, England, in February 2021, at 89, of natural causes. At the moment of her death, she held a quiet historical distinction. She was the last surviving credited cast member of Ben-Hur, the final living link to a film that had by then been over for 62 years. The actress who played the most patient, devoted woman in the film talked her own way out of a 5-picture studio contract using a fake political scandal she invented herself. Of everyone in this story, Haya Hararit held on the longest. 2021. Did that surprise you? Let me know. Simonides is Judah's loyal steward, a man whose quiet dignity survives years of suffering. Sam Jaffe, born Shalom Jaffe on New York's Lower East Side, brought that same quiet dignity to a career that had already survived something far more deliberate than fictional hardship: a real, government-engineered blacklist. Jaffe was effectively erased from Hollywood for roughly 7 years after being targeted during the McCarthy-era HUAC hearings. 20th Century Fox tried to drop him from The Day the Earth Stood Still over the controversy, and only kept him because the producer fought to retain him for the pivotal role of the Einstein-like Professor Barnhart.
It would take until the late 1950s, and directors like John Huston and William Wyler actively going out of their way to hire him before he worked steadily again. Wyler casting him as Simonides in Ben-Hur was, in its quiet way, an act of professional rehabilitation. Jaffe went on to a long second act on television, most notably as Dr. Zorba on Ben Casey opposite his wife, actress Betty Ackerman, before working steadily in film and TV well into his 80s. Jaffe died of cancer in Beverly Hills in March 1984, 2 weeks after turning 93. He was laid to rest at Eden Memorial Park in Mission Hills, California. The gentle servant in the film had spent years of his real life being treated by his own government as a threat to it.
Tirza is Judah's devoted sister, whose leprosy is miraculously cured at the film's climax. Kathy O'Donnell, born Ann Steely in a small Alabama mill town, was just as quietly devoted in her own life to a marriage that may have cost her the bigger career she clearly had the talent for. O'Donnell had broken through years earlier, playing the loyal sweetheart of a disabled veteran in the Oscar-sweeping The Best Years of Our Lives. But when she eloped with producer Robert Wyler, older brother of that film's director, William Wyler, studio chief Samuel Goldwyn took it as a personal betrayal. And, by the account of her own friends and co-stars, effectively ended her contract and pushed her toward the margins of the industry out of spite. Ben-Hur, made by her brother-in-law, was her final theatrical film. After 1959, she worked exclusively in television, in small roles on shows like Perry Mason and Bonanza, before quietly stepping away from acting altogether by the mid-1960s. She died on April 11th, 1970, her 22nd wedding anniversary, after a long battle with cancer. Balthazar, one of the three magi, is the film's voice of faith and moral conscience. Finlay Currie, the Scottish actor who played him, had one of the longest theatrical careers in this entire story, and very nearly didn't become a film actor at all. Currie trained as a church organist and choir master before he ever set foot on a stage, making his theatrical debut at 20 and not appearing in his first film until he was 53. He and his wife, Maude Courtney, had performed a song and dance act together across the United States back in the 1890s, decades before Hollywood epics were even a concept. He was 70 years old when he played Balthazar, and still doing his own light action work in films like Ivanhoe well into that decade of his life. Currie kept working steadily through his 80s, in films and television series like The Saint and Brigadoon, while quietly building a second career as a respected antiques dealer, specializing in coins and precious metals, a lifelong hobby that became, in his final years, almost a full second profession. Currie became a widower while Ben-Hur was still in its final months of filming, when his wife of decades passed away during the shoot. He outlived her by 9 years, dying in Gerrards Cross, England in May 1968 at 90 years old. His ashes were scattered at a crematorium outside London. The wise man who blessed Judah's journey in the film had spent his own youth as a vaudeville organist, decades before anyone in Hollywood thought to put a camera on him. Pontius Pilate, as Thring plays him, is cold, political, and chillingly pragmatic, a man who knows exactly what his power costs other people. Frank Thring, the Australian actor underneath the role, was almost the theatrical opposite, flamboyant, openly eccentric, and privately gay in an era and a country where that alone could have ended his career. Thring was born into Australian show business royalty
His father had founded a major film studio and a Melbourne radio station, and he was independently wealthy enough that he never strictly needed the work. He decorated his entire Melbourne home in black, walls included, and was famous for a persona so cuttingly sarcastic that fellow actors made a hobby out of trying and mostly failing to imitate his voice. Decades before homosexuality was decriminalized in his home state of Victoria, Thring lived his private life with a degree of openness that put him at genuine legal risk. He is also the only actor in film history to have portrayed on screen both Roman and Judean officials directly responsible for authorizing the crucifixion of Christ, Pilate here and King Herod a couple of years later in King of Kings. He could have stayed in Hollywood, cashing in on his villain typecasting, but chose instead to return home to Melbourne, joining a repertory theatre company and becoming a genuine institution of Australian stage and screen, right up through a memorable late-career villain role in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Thring battled esophageal cancer through 1994 and died that December at Epworth Hospital in Melbourne at 68. Per his wishes, he was cremated, and his ashes were scattered off the coast of Queenscliff, Victoria. The actor who played two different men responsible for crucifying Christ spent his real life hiding a single truth about himself that the law of his own country would have happily crucified him for. Frank Thring's story is the one people tend to know least about going in. Did anything here change how you see his pilot? Tell me below. Walk back through all of it, and the through line isn't tragedy, it's endurance dressed up as spectacle. A father who professionalized danger so his sons could survive it. A blacklisted actor handed his career back by directors who simply refused to pretend he didn't exist. A woman who invented a fake scandal to escape a contract, then lived freer and longer than almost anyone else in the cast. A villain who carried a secret his own country could have jailed him for, underneath a role written to make audiences hate him. The Chariots are long gone, sold for scrap. The 18-acre Roman arena dismantled within months so no rival studio could reuse it. Cinecitta's dust has settled. And somewhere between Golders Green Crematorium in London, Forest Lawn in Glendale, Oakwood Memorial Park in Chatsworth, and a stretch of coastline off Queenscliff, Australia, every single person who raced, romanced, or ruled in that arena has, by now, taken their final lap. The myth said a man died so the studio could keep a great shot. The truth is gentler and somehow more human. A son nearly died. His father nearly watched it happen. And everyone else in that cast went on to live entire second lives. In blacklists survived, in marriages that cost careers, in black-painted houses and antique coin shops and fishing boats, long after the dust of that arena had settled for good.